Well, Senate and House Democrats returning to Washington today for the first time since President Biden's poor debate performance. Now, after top House Democrats privately met on Sunday to talk about how they can convince President Biden to drop out of the race. This is according to reports. In an exclusive interview with ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos, President Biden doubled down about staying on the ballot.
I'm running again because I think I understand best what has to be done to take this nation to a completely new level. We're on our way.
To discuss the road ahead to the White House and what it means for the market, we want to bring in Ed Mills. He's Raymond James and managing director. Ed, it's good to see you. So President Biden had this interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos, and he did it to convince or try to help convince voters that he is suited, that he is the best person for Democrats to run on the ballot here in November. Was it enough? Did it change voters' minds, do you think?
Shauna, this is really tricky because he did better in that ABC interview than he did at the debate, but certainly didn't do enough where it was going to quiet critics. I think that it was a massive shift in sentiment, especially among congressional Democrats in the June debate against former President Trump. And what I've been telling clients is that people with power like to keep power, and we're on a collision course because Biden clearly looks as if he wants to stay in this race, and he has the delegates, if he stays in, to capture that nomination. On the flip side, congressional Democrats are looking at this race and are concerned that Biden's going to lose, and are even more concerned that it could cost them the majority in the House of Representatives, which Democrats were looking to be on a decent track to capture, and certainly really has to downgrade the chance that Democrats are able to hold on to the majority in the Senate. So that conflict here, I think, is going to play out very publicly this week. We probably have to have a decision mid-month because there's an August 7th deadline for the ballot in Ohio that Democrats need to make. And that's really, to me, where we're looking at when a full final solution will be developed.
Ed, as we're sitting here looking through the president's kind of rebuttal to fellow Democrats that have pushed back and congressional Democrats that have pushed back on him continuing to run, I'm looking at this letter where he's talking about even this morning, this process that was open to anyone who wanted to run. He feels a deep obligation to the faith, the trust of the voters of the Democratic Party placing in him to run this year. But with the clear erosion that has started to show up of that confidence in President Biden, how does this party now figure out, okay, where it remains and regains strength, especially with the business community, trying to make sure that it has its big donors that will still put money towards a campaign that has started to shift in this interim period?
Brad, you're right. I do think that one of the things that I tell clients at Raymond James is that things are impossible right up into the moment it's inevitable. And those things will happen pretty quickly. So in the interview with ABC News, Biden was very clear that he has not heard from the leadership of the Democratic Party, that he needs to step aside. He highlighted his conversations with Hakeem Jeffries, with Chuck Schumer, with governors. But if that were to start to shift and you did see a freezing of money, that it could change the calculus here. There is a difference now as it relates to financing your campaign where there's so many small dollar donations. And as long as he's keeping that, he probably can stay in the race. As it relates to the market, what we've been getting questions about is how much of a Trump victory is getting priced in. Was that part of the steepening of the yield curve that we saw last week? When we look at the agenda of tariffs, of potential extension of the tax cuts, are there inflationary concerns that could impact the monetary policy decisions of the Federal Reserve? All of these are major questions that are hinging on the question of, is Biden going to stay in the race? And if he does, can he win the presidency?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about how this all plays out in the markets. I guess two questions here. One, is there between former President Trump and President Biden, is there consensus on who is better for the markets and why? And then my second question will be, as we talk about the fact that even though maybe it's not too likely, but this potential for President Biden to be replaced on the ballot, of the names that are being floated, is there one that's better for the market than the others?
So, Shauna, I'd start with the first question you had. I think that there are a knee-jerk reaction that a Trump victory could be a boost to the market, especially in areas that are heavily regulated, that have seen slowdowns of M&A or could benefit from the continuation of the tax cuts. So financials kind of front and foremost on that list. I think you would see a bid in bank stocks in a Trump victory. But the thing I do remind folks at Raymond James is that when we go back to the first term of President Trump, there were multiple times where the S&P 500 were down more than 20% over the China trade fight, and he's vowed to restart that. So I think there's more volatility, even though there could be that knee-jerk positive reaction in a Trump victory. I was meeting with clients in Europe 2 weeks ago, and they, I think, generally felt as if there was a continuation of the Biden presidency. A lot of the clean energy and infrastructure projects could get a continued boost, and the allocation to the United States because of a known outcome of what was going to happen in D.C. Would keep greater confidence. So it's a much more nuanced answer versus like one good versus one bad.
And then on the second part of Shauna's question there as well, if Biden was to be replaced, is there, of the list of candidates, someone who the markets would look as best outcome?
So it's hard because I think that the most likely candidate, in our opinion, would be Kamala Harris, the vice president, taking over the nomination. First and foremost, she's been the vice president. That's the role of the vice president if the president's not able to serve. She also would be able to inherit the campaign infrastructure and funding. So she's put at the top of the list. When we've debated at Raymond James some of the differences in policy between a Kamala Harris and a Joe Biden, there's not a huge gap because Vice President Harris, when she was in the Senate, she certainly was kind of a leader on issues, but there's not a whole list of policy differences that you would have if there were to be at the top of the list a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren or someone from the much more progressive wing of the party. So if it is Harris, I don't really think that there's a big change. I think she is more liberal on things, but her ability to get things done because she doesn't have the same deal-making experience that Joe Biden has because he's been in D.C. for 50 years. The question is maybe a little bit more liberal, but maybe fewer things get accomplished. So from a market perspective, I don't think there's a huge change. The only change that could be kind of priced in is she might have some more downside to Biden as it relates to the election, but she also has a lot more potential upside. And so if we were talking about a Democratic sweep, we'd be looking at increases in tax rates, changes to the number of prescription drugs we negotiate on, maybe a more enforced M&A environment. So that's where we could see patches of weakness in this market, Brad.
Ed Mills, Raymond James, Managing Director. Ed, great to see you, and thanks as always
Likewise.
for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Certainly.